All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining. My name is Alex Siggers, and I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative. That's the organization that composes these GSBI Speaks webinar talks. Today's webinar will be a conversation between Dr. Zoë Lindo and Richard Bardgett regarding Dr. Bardgett's new book, The Ecology of Soil: From Communities to Ecosystems. Before the webinar starts, I have a few housekeeping points to bring up. First, the webinar will be recorded, and if you're not comfortable with this, we kindly ask you to please disconnect and view the recording at a later time. The webinar will be posted to YouTube shortly after the webinar concludes. Second, all questions will be received through the Q&A and asked orally by our moderator, so please add any questions you have to the Q&A box below. No questions will be answered directly in the chat, which ensures any YouTube viewers hear all question responses. So we thank you very much for being here, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Lindo to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. So today we're celebrating the release of The Ecology of Soil, a work that synthesizes decades of research, also brings a fresh, forward-looking perspective to the ecology of soil. And our author, Dr. Richard Bardgett, has been a foundational voice in soil ecology and for the GSBI. Many of us, including myself, grew up professionally or academically with his 2005 book, The Biology of Soils, on our shelves. And so this new book reflects on 20 years of how the field has evolved, how much the world has changed, how central soils have become to global conversations about the environment, sustainability, biodiversity. Again, I'm thrilled to be your moderator. My name is Dr. Zoë Lindo. I'll be guiding the conversation today as we dive into the motivations, the processes, and the forward-looking ideas behind this book. Again, if you have any questions for Richard, please put them in the Q&A, and Alex will be moderating the Q&A. And I'm sure we'll have time to answer any of the questions that you might have for Richard at the end of our session. Richard, thank you for being here today. How are you?
Thank you. Yeah, very good. Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me to be here to talk about the book.
Yeah, we're excited. So let's start at the beginning. So why don't you tell us a little bit about why did you write this book and why did you write this book now?
Well, why I wrote it now, I actually did start writing it some time ago, which I guess we might come to later. But really the main reason was that the publisher of the Biology of Soil contacted me, particularly Ian Sherman, who was the person who commissioned books at the time. And he contacted me probably about 2015, so about 10 years ago, actually, asking if I'd be interested in doing a second edition of the book. And I was interested because I was obviously aware that the field had developed so much over that time. At that time, that was 10 years. And as I'll talk about later, it actually took 20 years before the book was actually published. So it really seemed to me timely to do an update of that particular book. I mean, the other thing as well was I'd also just finished writing another book, again commissioned by Oxford, which was more of a general science book called Earth Matters. And I finished that in 2016, which is when I rapidly signed the contract to do the second edition of the Biology Soil after that.
Nice.
So that was really the motivation at the time.
Yeah, yeah. And so it has been 2 decades, right? And so much has changed in soil ecology, including the formation of the GSBI. Can you tell us a little bit about how that shifting landscape has influenced the new book?
Well, I think the biggest influence of the book was that it started off as a second edition of the Biology of Soil. I mean, that was the original plan, and I worked on that plan for probably 2, 3 years. And when I was writing the early chapters, they were pretty much a revision of what I'd already written before, just adding more information because they were about what lives in the soil, what those organisms do. But then as I sort of progressed through the book, it became clear to me that the pace of the field had developed so rapidly, the book was just getting bigger and bigger. It was meant to be quite a concise book, like the Biology of the Soil. So it just grew in size, grew in terms of the information that was contained in it. And also, I just found it really hard keeping up with the actual pace of the field, which again is something I might talk about later. So after conversations with the publisher, we decided that it should be a new book. So it's still very much rooted in the Biology of Soil, and the earlier chapters are quite similar. but it has new chapters which really reflect the development of the field. I think for me as well, it really sort of captures, or it gave an opportunity to capture the developments in the field, but also to place them in terms of the foundational work in the field, which to me is something that's also quite important.
Mhm.
So really, that was how that changed the book and how I actually wrote it.
Right. So I think that that reflects a little bit of the shift in the title, right? So the new title,
Yeah.
the biology of soil to the ecology of soil. Is there something deeper behind that other than it just simply wasn't the second edition, or does that shift reflect a change in the perspective or the approach or the thoughts that we have about soil?
Yeah, it was a combination of things. It was a practical thing in that the biology of soil was part of a series, the biology of habitats. So they're all called the
Mm.
biology of something. So that was why it was called the biology of soils. But I must admit, I always felt, even when I wrote that, that it was really about the ecology of soils, because the book is really about interactions between soil organisms, between organisms and plants, between plants, their consumers, and soil organisms, and then placing that into a much bigger context of environmental change, climate change, land use change, for example. So, really, at the heart of the book is the ecology of soil. And I guess that's why I also added the subtitle from communities to ecosystems, which I think also reflects the development of the field in that it probably was started more looking at populations and community interactions, but now it's very much shifting towards a bigger ecosystem context for the
Right,
field. In that,
right.
soil ecology is being applied to much bigger questions related to ecosystem ecology. So that was really the sort of reasoning behind that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. And so also along with this sort of shift towards more bigger scale questions, are these some of the things that surprised you as you started writing the book? I mean, your original perspective was just sort of to update the information, but then the transition into a different perspective. Were there other types of surprises that sort of emerged as you were writing this?
Yeah, I wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't say there were sort of big surprises. In that I'm obviously involved in the field, so I was sort of aware of how the field was actually developing. I think some of the things that sort of has surprised me is the sort of diversity of approaches that are now being applied to soil, which has certainly changed from when I was writing the book in the early 2000s. And also the sort of geographical range, because the original book, I would say most of the references are from North America, Europe, whereas now there's a much richer diversity of literature in the field of soil ecology. I mean, one area in particular is China has exploded, I think, in terms of the information on soil ecology that's actually been coming out of the field. But I think in terms of, I mean, there were some things that I think were quite exciting, I would say. I think the quantification of biodiversity is a big area now. Molecular tools have really sort of transformed the field. I think there's a much deeper understanding of the factors that regulate diversity, both spatially and to some extent temporally. And I think there's also a boom in understanding about rhizosphere communities and how plants shape soil communities and the significance of that for carbon cycling, nitrogen cycling, for example, which are all big shifts, I think, in understanding. But I would say the sort of real area that's sort of exploded is what I consider in the last two chapters, climate change research, both in terms of impacts of climate change on soils, but how soils can contribute to adaptation, and how soil ecology can inform sustainability challenges, which is something we might touch on later.
You know, I've actually kind of spent a lot of time thinking about how people's perception of soil has changed throughout my career. What do you think has driven this, I'll just say, visibility of soils and their importance? Because I remember a time when soil was literally just the dirt under your feet, and people had no concept of who lived in it and what they did and the functional importance. So what do you think has actually driven this visibility of soils over the past 20 years?
Yeah, and I mean that's something I didn't just mentioned before, I mean, that was certainly something, if I reflect on the book, that's become increasingly clear, just how awareness of soils,
Mhm.
not just on scientists, but more broadly, among policymakers, farmers, has increased dramatically. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to really pinpoint what actually triggered that. So I guess it's probably a combination of different factors. I think one thing that certainly contributed is carbon sequestration and recognition of the importance of soils for carbon storage. I think a lot of interest in biodiversity policies has also helped to elevate soil biodiversity up the political agenda. As people realize the importance of biodiversity. And I think another really big area is in terms of food production. A lot of farmers now, I mean, I find it remarkable and well, just fantastic, really, that the thirst for information about how farmers or people can manage their land in a way to get the best out of the organisms in the soil. So there has been a real growing awareness, and I guess lots of things have contributed to that. I mean, one thing I would say has contributed significantly is the emblem that's behind you, the GSBI. I think has, and particularly the work of Diana Wall, I think was tremendous in terms of really raising awareness more broadly of the importance of soils and biodiversity within the broader societal communities, really. But it's sort of a combination of things, I guess, that have contributed.
And likely technology as well, our ability to actually now see some of those organisms, microbes, and et cetera, and quantify them more accurately, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah, and not just our knowledge of soils, the discovery of soils, discovery about how many species are found in particular environments, etc. I think all this has sort of elevated awareness about just how rich soil communities are and how important they are for regulating ecosystems and various services that land provides.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to agree with you there. I don't
Yeah.
know why everybody doesn't study soil, but okay. So many people dream of writing a book one day, right? Few know about the actual process and what that actually looks like. So maybe we can delve a little bit into telling us a little bit about your writing regime. How long did the book take? How much time did you typically devote to it on a given day? Do you write better in the mornings, in the evenings? How do you actually get this task done?
Right. Yeah. Well, I have to say, this book was more challenging than any of the books. I've actually written four books in total and edited another one. This was the most challenging. And I think probably the reason why is because I probably have more jobs to do other than being able to sit down and write. So, I think that created quite a lot of challenges for me. So just give you an example, the biology of soil took me probably 3 years to write. This took me 8 years to actually write. And one of the things I mentioned in the preface was Ian Sherman, who was sort of encouraging me to write it. He's very effective in making sure I kept on track in terms of writing it. But there were times when I really struggled to put any effort into it. I mean, in terms of how I actually did it, I mean, one thing is I like writing, and I also I sort of have a romantic idea about having a contract to write a book over me, and it makes me feel like I'm a writer in Paris in a small loft or something like that. But in this case, I did it really in blocks of time rather than chipping away at it constantly. So I typically spent time in Innsbruck, for example, where I go in the winters and I get a bit more time to work on it there, and then blocks of time in the summer. But last year, when it was starting to drag on, I really then put in a lot of effort to get it finished because I just wanted to get it actually done and finished. I think, as a general comment about writing, I think you really do need time because in our jobs, you're pulled all over the place and fragmented. And one of the things I always find challenging is suddenly having a block of time and then switching to writing because your mind's used to being pulled all over the place and doing this, that, and the other. So it always took a while to get back into the swing of writing. But fortunately, I managed to find time to be
Mhm.
able to do that.
So I guess that could translate to perhaps some of the students that are out there thinking about how they're going to write their PhD dissertation. And
Yeah,
yeah, it's really, you really do need those blocks of time. And
I think you do,
how do you
yeah,
make those blocks of time?
yeah, you have to, and you have to be very disciplined in maintaining those blocks as well, because there's always pressures and distractions from outside. But one thing I think everyone would probably agree with is when you do put time into something, it does get easier after a while. You get consumed by it, and it becomes, certainly for me, it becomes a sort of major drive to work on my book. It's one of the main things I'm thinking about. So I think yeah, you just need to find that time to invest in the actual writing.
Good advice. So 8 years,
Yeah.
that's a long time. And of course, we've sort of mentioned technological advances and how fast those technological advances have happened, as well as the constantly expanding literature. So at some point, you have to stop writing the book. And so how did you manage dealing with revisions? How did you make that decision to finally stop incorporating new literature? How do you know when to finally stop? And this might also be a piece of advice for perhaps PhD students writing their dissertation.
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is I could still be writing a book now if I hadn't have decided to stop. I mean, the field is developing fast. There's always new discoveries coming out, and it's hard to keep up with all those things. But you have to make a decision to stop. In my case, I started writing the earlier chapters, and they were relatively easy, as I mentioned before, because they were updates of the previous ones. But I still had to keep going back to them all the time because, particularly, chapter two's on the diversity of life in soil, and there's been developments all the time. So, every week almost, I would come across some paper which I had to go back to that chapter to revise, etc., what was there. And then the later chapters were probably a bit easier. So, for example, the one on sustainability challenges, I'm guessing, but the majority of the references were post 2020 because it's a relatively new field. So I didn't really need to go back too much for that.
Mhm.
But to stop, I just made a decision about this time last year that A, I needed to finish, and B, I needed to have a deadline. And I just set myself a deadline, which was the end of January. And I just thought, right, from then on, I'm not updating anything more in the book. So for me, that was the deadline. And then I submitted the book in April, and it went from there.
Right, right. And so maybe thinking now about the publishing experience then, and the
Yeah.
inspiration, the hard work behind writing the book is obviously one aspect of it, but publishing is another. And fortunately, you had sort of a publisher that approached you. But maybe you can tell us, or perhaps demystify for some of us who might be interested in writing a book, that publishing process.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, as I said, I already had a relationship with a publisher, so it was Ian Sherman who approached me, and as he did for many of the other books, and Ian's very persuasive, and he managed to persuade me to write the book. I would say the best thing if you have an idea is at conferences, for example, there are often bookstores, there are representatives of different publishers. So mine was with Oxford University Press. They usually will have someone there who's looking for new topics. And I would go up to them and talk to them if you've got an idea for a new book. From there, if they're interested, you have to then have a contract. Well, actually, generally, what you do is write a summary of the book, the intended audience, why it's timely, why it's different to other books in the field, because obviously they want a book that's distinct because they want it to be influential. And then if they agree to it, you would sign a contract, and from there, you're ready to go.
Mhm. And do they provide a little bit of feedback if they have their own sort of ideas or what they think is sort of more marketable or something, or do they help you flesh out ideas as well, or is it sort of
Yeah, they do.
all on
So,
you
so
for the pitch?
Yeah, so in my case, I was asked to write a proposal, which I did, and then they sent it out to review. So they sent it to four or five reviewers who provided constructive comments on different aspects of the book and how I could change different things. And that was actually really helpful. And it's very helpful to get it at that particular stage because, when you're doing something yourself in your own mind, it's very easy to forget about a particular group of organisms or some kind of application. So that's how that actually worked. And then in terms of the actual chapters, I relied on my colleagues to review them. So I contacted lots of people who, fortunately gave their time to provide very helpful and constructive reviews on them.
Mhm.
The publishers, they do proofread, so they don't send the book to review at all before it's published. They rely on the initial review, or at least Oxford did. But what they do is copy edit and proofread to go through the actual text in some sort of detail.
Mhm. And so were there unexpected challenges in the publishing
Oh,
process?
oh, there certainly were. Yeah. Wow. To me, there were two. I mean, the biggest one is, again, it's something I mentioned in the preface for the book, is I don't use a reference manager and I never have. And I mean, there's thousands of references in this book, and I did them all manually. Fortunately, one of my PhD students helped me, Adam. He was a great help. He's acknowledged in the book. He did help me in terms of compiling them all. But wow, I would just advise anyone use a reference manager. I don't think I ever will because it's too late for me. But that was it was a massive job. And the other one that was really big job is all the permissions, in that the responsibility is on the author to get permission to reproduce all the figures. So pretty much all the figures, you have to contact the publisher to get permission to publish them. And in most cases, it's straightforward, but it can be quite complicated in many cases. And that took a lot of time. I mean, just those two things alone were quite a significant piece of work, which I hadn't really anticipated or factored in.
Right. Yeah. You think about writing a book as, like you said, sitting in a cafe and doing this creative process, but figuring out permissions and formatting all of your thousands of
Oh,
references is part of the process.
yeah. I mean, it's sort of mildly therapeutic in some ways, but I would certainly not advise anyone taking it on.
Fair enough. Um, okay, so how many chapters does the book have? Sorry, I've
Eight chapters,
eight
I think. I'm
chapters.
not sure. I have to
Right.
check. I'm pretty sure there's eight chapters. Yeah. Yeah.
And the last chapter of the book is sort of looking towards the future.
Yeah.
And so what do you see? What do you see as the most important developments on the horizon for soil ecology? Where do you think we're going? Are there emergent theories or paradigms that you see, or perhaps even just greater integration with policy or more application for soil ecology?
Yeah. I mean, there are clearly, in the last chapter, I identified 10 areas, which, from my perspective at least, I think are probably going to be areas that will occupy soil ecologists in the future. And I think among them, there are some key, I mean, AI is going to have, I think, a tremendous impact on the field. And I would say, if I really think about having written it, what I would say is the big challenges for the future. These aren't things that I'm going to be able to address, but I think they're things for the future. What one is, I would say, predictive soil ecology. I was actually giving a talk recently in Grenoble in France, and I had a question at the end of it in that it was about the fact that a lot of the information we have is either about patterns, describing patterns that we see and providing explanations for them, or experimental work. And one of the things I was sort of left feeling is that although we have growing knowledge in the field, we have lots of case studies providing additional evidence to support this happening, that happening, a particular mechanism occurring. So, for me, a real challenge is to be more predictive in terms of soil ecology, developing theories, developing ways of making predictions about how soil communities will change in the future and what the implications of that will be for ecosystems. Because at the moment we're still in this, you know, context dependency is like a recurring word. So,
Mhm.
what are the general rules if they are, and what kind of theories can explain it in the future? So that's
Right.
one area. I would say the other really important area relates to what you were talking about before, about this growing awareness and sort of like thirst for knowledge about the ecology of soil and how you can harness that to actually make management decisions for sustainable challenges. And that to me has got to be one of the biggest challenges in the future. How do we harness that knowledge? How do we actually implement it in different management systems? And how do we make sure that those management interventions are sort of tailored towards local
Mhm.
conditions,
Mhm.
environment? So I would say they're the two sort of big areas that
And they're related though, right? I mean, our ability to harness the power of soil ecology, as you sort of put it, relates back to where we've been in terms of, patterns and experiments, but then translating that into understanding mechanism, processes. And I think that also reflects on the subtitle of your book, this idea of communities to ecosystems as well, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, very, very much so. And looking for generalities or looking for how we can tailor our understanding to particular conditions, because things will operate differently in different places, it is really fundamental to harnessing the value of soil ecology within a lot of these sustainable challenges. Because basically, one thing doesn't fit everything. And also, soil ecology is just one part of the system. If you want to manage land for carbon sequestration or restoration, it's not just about the ecology of soil. There are obviously many other factors that you need to take into account. But yes, they are very, very much interrelated.
Mhm. So is there something that you learned while you were writing that changed how you think about soils?
I wouldn't say there was anything. I mean, I learned lots of amazing, reading lots of papers, learning lots of new things, and it's always great to learn, basically. That's what keeps us in our jobs and keeps us excited. I think the main general thing I would take is just how fast the field is moving, which is we talked about before. I mean, when I wrote the previous book in 2000 or whatever, it was a minority subject, in a lot of ways. It wasn't well embedded within terrestrial ecology, for example, whereas now it's changed so much. And just this real thirst for knowledge as well, I think, from a broader range of audiences, if you like, farmers, policymakers, etc. I think
Mhm.
that's probably one of the biggest sort of take-home messages that I got from the.
Is there anything that you think is going to maybe spark debate in the field, or is there a concept or a chapter in the book that might be
Yeah,
controversial or
yeah. I mean, I've never thought soils and their ecology are particularly controversial, but I think some things might generate debate. I mean, I was contacted just yesterday by someone about a new estimate of the diversity of organisms within the soil. So there's obviously going to be debate in that area, and I think as technology develops and people look more into that kind of question, there will be certainly changes in estimates of what we know about just enumerating diversity. I think the biggest sort of debates will probably come in terms of how you can apply soil ecology challenges to sustainability challenges. So one area I touch on in the book, for example, is soil amendments. There's a lot of interest in inoculants, for example, different types of amendments, crushed wet rock weathering, biochar, for example. And those are areas that seem a bit more controversial. And probably the jury is still out to some extent on how widely they can be applied to address sustainability challenges. So I'd say they're probably the areas where there's likely to be a lot more debate in the future. I'm not sure whether my book will contribute. It doesn't have the answers to that, but it does at least highlight some of the debates and challenges in that particular area.
right? So now that the book's complete, how does it feel?
Well, it feels great. I mean, it was great just when I decided to stop writing, as I mentioned before. That was just such a relief at the time, really, because as I said, it was quite. But I think the nicer thing about a book is, I mean, I've got a copy here in my hand. I mean, that's the best thing about writing a book is I only got that last week, so I've only had this 4 or 5 days myself. So actually, seeing what you've done yourself, I think, is really very satisfying thing to do. I mean, people can make of it as they like, but for me, having put all that effort in to synthesize something is really personally, I'm something I'm very pleased I made the effort to do.
And so do you have any ideas of what you're going to do next? Is there another book? Is there?
Yeah, I mean, I have actually signed a contract to write another book. So it only took me 3 or 4 days after this, but it's actually a general science book, and I'll be working with a gardener who has a lot of experience in the soil. And the idea is we're going to write a more general science book for gardeners about how they can get the best out of their soil for growing different plants. So yeah, it didn't take me long. I think I mentioned before, I like the idea of being a writer. I have a very romantic view of it, possibly, but I like having a big project over me that I can really
Mhm.
focus on. So I really am looking forward to
Yeah,
working on that as
yeah.
well.
And part of your past experience is, as far as I remember, is you had these wonderful experiences in gardens and with agriculture and this sort of connection to soil in a very applied sense. Is that driving this next book?
I think it's probably, I mean, one of the things I'm sure many people do is we all give talks, academic talks, which is great, but then increasingly, I'm sure many of us are called on or asked to give talks to the general public. And one of the questions where you're always asked when you give talks to the general public is mainly about gardening, because that's what most people have access to, and that's where people are curious about what they can do to manage their soils and what they can do to contribute to some of these big sustainability challenges. So I think that was probably one of the main motivations for writing the actual book. I mean, again, I was contacted about it, so
Right.
in that sense, it was a little bit easy to do.
Do you have a big
Yeah,
garden?
there's a thirst for knowledge, as I said before, about
Yeah,
soils.
yeah.
Hopefully this will be able to contribute in some way to that.
Do you have a big garden?
My garden's out there in the back. It's moderately big. Yeah, I like gardening. But I was brought up, my father was a farmer, and I've had a very strong connection with the land throughout my life, really. So I think
Yeah,
it's something that's really sort of embedded
yeah, yeah,
in the
yeah.
book.
Okay, so maybe just a few questions to close here. So we'll just talk about sort of the book itself, maybe a little bit of the marketing for it. So who do you see as the intended audience for this book? Is it sort of at the appropriate grad student level? Is it for the knowledgeable scientist in the field? Who's the intended
I
audience?
I would, I think it's predominantly targeted, I would say, at more advanced undergraduates and postgraduate students. So if you were a PhD student just starting off, hopefully it's the kind of book that would just give you a grounding in the field about what's happening, what's known about soils, and also where the field is actually going. But I would also hope it would appeal to people who are also more established in the field, or people from other disciplines who are becoming interested in
Mhm,
soil, because it's quite clear that people, ecologists, plant ecologists, microbiologists, etc., are becoming more interested in studying the soil. So hopefully it could provide a few insights to
mhm,
the people there.
mhm,
I think one thing I would also mention about the book, which I've tried to do, and I think which has come from the first edition, is there's always an emphasis very much on what's happening now and recent publications. But one of the things I've really tried to do is to ground what we now know within what we knew 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I've tried to ground it in the very sort of foundational work in different
mhm,
fields, which I think hopefully gives people a perception of how the field has
mhm.
developed over the years.
Yeah, I really like that approach. I think it's important to understand how the progression of thought has worked and how we've built on foundational knowledge to get where we are now. So
Yeah.
maybe related to that, what are your hopes for early career researchers? They're going to buy your book, and what are you hoping that they're going to take away from the book?
Well, I think the first thing I would hope they would take away that soil ecology is a really exciting topic. One thing I often mention when I started off, I'm quite heavily involved in the British Ecological Society, and we always have an annual meeting. And I always remember as a PhD student giving talks on soil ecology. And the audience was pretty much made up of the people who were giving talks. It was a handful of people, whereas now there's much more people involved. And so I hope the book gives an impression of the fast pace and development of the field, but also how relevant it is to addressing sustainability challenges. And I guess the other point, the last point I would make is what I just said before about the importance of the foundational work in the field. Some of the pioneers in the field who influenced what I did and what, many of us did in the sort of 80s and 90s. I think, there was some really exciting work done at that time that really laid the foundation, I think, for what we know about soil today.
Mhm. So, who was the most inspirational person when you were growing up as a soil ecologist?
Wow. Well, I mean, my PhD supervisors, I think, were very influential to me. That was Juliet Frankland and John Whitaker, who I actually acknowledge in the book.
Nice.
Gregor Yates, he's a nematologist in New Zealand. Again, sadly, he passed away some years ago, but he was an enormous influence on me and the work I did in the future. Dinah Wall was, she was a force of nature in the field, and I was very fortunate to have been able to work with Diana, and she strongly influenced the work I did.
Mhm.
But I think that there was also, I think when I think back to when I was a PhD student, there was a group in Georgia, David Coleman and Dak Crosley, etc. That their work, and also Joe Anderson in the
Mhm.
UK, that they to me were really some of the main sort of founders of the field of soil ecology, and their work has been enormously influential in terms of what I've done, and I think more generally in the field.
Absolutely. Okay, so last question for me. Maybe we can see the cover of the book
Yeah.
again. And yeah, you can tell us a little bit about the cover of the book, what inspired it, and what does it represent to you?
Well, actually, it was my wife who painted the cover of the soil, and throughout the book, I've used some of her pictures, and I
Mhm.
often do within my papers, etc. She's an artist. She's not a soil painter at all. It's not what she normally does at all. But I did ask her if she would make a cover for the book, and I pretty much left it to her. I gave her a few sort of hints about what I wanted for the cover. But the other intriguing thing about it is that the actual pigments that we use for the paints actually came from local soils around here as well. So, the picture is it's obviously of personal importance to me as well because it was painted by my wife, but also it's of local importance because the paints came from where I'm from in the north of England.
Very nice. Very nice. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's important for people to know that there's real personal connections to some of this work. So that's all the questions that I have for you. And so, of course, the Ecology of Soil is available now. I believe Alex has perhaps posted some of the links. Um, yes, there we go. And maybe I'll invite Alex back on the screen, and he can help moderate some of the questions here in the Q&A.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Richard. Thank you, Zoe. We have quite a few questions in the Q&A. So Zoe, can you see these questions yourself?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. So I'll let you ask Richard if that's okay, and I'll just
Sure.
move them over as you ask them, and we'll be good to go.
Sure. So I'm just going to start right at the top. And we have which are the questions that could not be answered 20 years ago, and which can we answer now? And perhaps this is a two-part question. Are there new questions, new approaches, views nobody could think about 20 years ago?
Well, I mean the biggest sort of development I would say of the last 20 years or certainly 25 years is the sort of explosion of molecular tools, both taxonomic and functional tools, which have really enabled, a deep interrogation of the diversity of organisms and how they respond to environmental pressures or how they're shaped spatially and temporally. But I think also what the functional capacity of those organisms, things like metagenomics, metatranscriptomics, etc.
Mhm.
That they've really had quite a remarkable impact on the field. I don't know. I mean, there will have been new concepts developed from that, but I think what it's just enabled is a deeper interrogation of what's there and what those organisms actually do.
And 20 years hasn't been that long. And we've made such huge strides in some of these areas to be able to do what we do.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, if you looked at DGGE or something, you might be able to use 4 or 5 samples or something like that. But now, that just the accessibility of these kind of approaches, I think, is really having a massive impact on the
Yeah.
actual field as
Also, in
well.
terms of processing, cost, even.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so our next question, how to motivate younger generations of different academic ages, example students, to read a book.
Well, yeah, I think it's becoming more difficult. I think books are becoming less popular generally. But I think a book to me is something you want to pick up and not put down. I'm not saying my book will necessarily do that, but to me, they tell a story basically. So they should be compelling and have a sort of depth of knowledge that would enrich and inform someone and inspire them to actually do their own work and develop their own ideas. So I think you can get that to some extent from papers, but it's more piecemeal bits of information. So I think what books provide is a real synthesis, a substantial piece of work on the field and how a field is developed and the various challenges that can be addressed. So I think they certainly have an important place in the field and more broadly.
Mhm. Yeah, I would say it's more of a immersive
Yeah,
experience, and I feel sorry for people that don't read books because I
yeah.
think they're really missing out.
Yeah, and it's like anything. It's like I was saying before about writing a book. We're pulled all over the place increasingly and distracted by this, that, and the other. But actually sitting down and immersing yourself in something,
Mhm.
reading any book, not, I'm not suggesting you have to do that with my book, but it is a very fulfilling experience, I think, and you do really learn a lot from the experience. But not just what you read. I think it's more what it generates in your own mind, and that's something I've certainly found from writing a book. It generates ideas in your own mind because you synthesize information, you see patterns, and from that comes ideas.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I certainly encourage people to read books.
Our next question, given how large the field of soil ecology is, did you determine a research path as a grad student? How would you advise incoming grad students now? Excellent question.
You advise to make a path in the field, you mean, or in terms of
How do you make decisions about what you're going to do with your life?
what you're going to do? Well, I think fundamentally, in terms of the actual science, I think, it might sound a bit obvious, but I think you've got to be interested and motivated by the actual ideas you address. I mean, a lot of people will say to me, is it novel? What they're actually testing, or there's lots of people working in a field. But people take different approaches to things. They have different perceptions on things. And I think, but fundamentally, if you're interested in a topic and you want to study a particular topic, you will inevitably make a contribution to that particular field. So I think you've got to, it's finding something you are interested in first and foremost, because doing any form of research, if you're not interested, it's, arguably going to be a bit of a battle. And I think by having that interest, you'll hopefully submerge yourself more into that particular idea.
Mhm.
And I think also, challenging conventions and ideas and things, not just accepting certain
What
things
do you
that
mean
might.
by that?
Yeah. Well, there might be certain concepts, for example, that are sort of well embedded in the literature. I mean, one of the ones I've worked on when I first started was this idea of fungal bacterial pathways, for example, and I still do to some extent. But I think the field has developed sufficiently to show that, it's not that clear cut, and there's actually a lot of crossover between those particular pathways. And, I think that's a bit, and science, that's what's exciting about science. I think, ideas are put forward or concepts shape the field, but they are there to be challenged in the future and hopefully progress the field.
Yeah, great advice. Yeah. Um, how much research concerning worm pile management for soil health and erosion control in the future is being done? And did you cover this area in your book?
I wouldn't say I touched one of the things I did touch on was ecosystem restoration. So in the final chapter, I talk about sustainability challenges, so food production, climate mitigation, and biodiversity conservation and restoration of degraded habitats. So the role of earthworms and other macrofauna is certainly considered in terms of their benefits for physical properties of soils. And to some extent, that's also included in agriculture production about how earthworms can benefit soil structure and crop yields, and also in ecosystem restoration, how important they are for stabilizing the soil and enhancing restoration of land. I mean, there isn't an awful lot on soil erosion per se, I would say, but there is a growing amount of work on how organisms contribute to physical properties within the soil, which is, it's a absolutely critical area.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps this is a bit of a related question. Hi, Richard. I noticed you did not have a chapter on soil health. Is that intentional, or did you forget it? Winky face.
Yeah, I thought about it a lot, really. I mean, soil health. I Well, to me, the book it's about, as I said before, the ecology of soil fundamentally. And in the last chapter, I talk about a lot of issues that basically underpin soil health. So soil health comes up more in the context of addressing sustainability challenges, and in particular related to food production. So yeah, and again, it's when you're writing something, you can't include everything. But what I want, for me, the important thing was the book is embedded in ecological principles and what we know about the ecology of soil, and then finally how we can potentially use that knowledge to address some of these challenges, rather than an applied book, for example, on
Mhm,
quantifying and measuring soil health.
mhm,
So I wouldn't, I mean, it's obviously a really important area, but I would say that, or I'll hope that the knowledge contained in the book provides a foundation for addressing some of those challenges. I mean, another area I sort of pondered over was contamination, soil contamination, because that's a big area. I sort of touch on it, but again, I didn't make it a central focus of the book.
mhm, mhm. Perhaps in your next book.
Possibly, yeah.
Do you have an outline for your next book yet, or that's still
We're working on
you're working
it.
on it? Okay, okay. Okay, so our next question. I'm leading a seminar based primarily around your book. That's great. What activities or discussions would you recommend? Oh, excellent question.
I think, well, the two chapters, I think, for me, I mean, if I was doing a class with them, I think the last two chapters are probably the ones that might lend themselves best to that. So the one on sustainability challenges, because as I said before, there are quite a lot of areas of debate and a lot of uncertainty still in those particular areas. And then finally, the one on sort of future directions, I think hopefully would provide a basis for interesting debate.
Mhm. Definitely, people are very interested in soil health.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
do you what is I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Yeah.
What is your definition, or what is your concept of soil health?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting because ever since I started, people have been talking about different aspects of soil health, soil quality, which are obviously more chemical, physical properties, and now obviously soil health as it becomes more biological, the biology of soil is more integrated in it. I mean, to me, the health of the soil is really the capacity of that soil to do what it is that well, what it's actually doing, i.e., supporting a natural forest, or whether it's supporting heathland vegetation, or whether it's actually producing crops. And I mean, I almost feel like the best way to actually assess soil health is really just to dig a hole and have a look. Because I think if you're, you can see like an agricultural soil, if people, I mean, obviously you need to know what you're looking for, but there are certain indicators in a soil which I think can indicate whether or not that soil is performing well, whether
Mhm,
it's compacted, whether it's waterlogged, etc., whether there's no organic matter or very little organic matter. These things are pretty
mhm,
obvious to the eye.
mhm,
So I think, using that to identify properties that can be measured to support
mhm.
those ideas, because, not everyone can look in a hole,
Yeah,
etc. I think
yeah.
is probably.
Do you feel compelled to smell soils? I feel
I
compelled
always do.
to
Yeah,
smell
I
them.
always
Yeah.
do. I always do. I used to taste soils as well on field trips where I was told not to by one of my for health and safety reasons.
Okay.
But
Uh,
I would say, with soil health is, there's a lot of new technologies, etc., out there that could offer ways. I think particularly sensor technology, etc., for measuring
mhm,
various soil properties, I think offer a way of being able to capture soil properties on a
mhm,
much larger scale.
mhm, mhm. Okay, so our next question, we have looks like three more questions. Um, do you trust that your students actually still read books? So we're coming back to that, or do they just ask Chat GPT and the like? I mean, would you like to comment on what impact AI might have on the future of soil ecology slash science in general?
Well, yeah, I mean, AI is, I mean, I am also an editor of a journal, Journal of Ecology, and, AI is a topic that we increasingly talk about, both in terms of handling data, but also in terms of actually the writing and reviewing of papers as well. And yeah, I mean, it's transforming the way people do their work, but it also brings various ethical challenges as well. Um, I, I, I mean, as I said before, I have quite a romantic view of writing and books, etc. So I always sort of hold on to the view that people, or at least some people, will want to read something more substantial like a book and immerse themselves in the
Mhm,
particular field. And yeah, AI, I don't know. I just don't know how it would actually achieve that. But it's certainly a challenge. It's a big challenge in the way people operate, and it's a big challenge in the way that people will and do get information nowadays from books.
mhm. Do you think students are still reading books?
Uh, I think that probably less so.
Yeah.
I'd say probably less so, but I sort of, I'm generally quite optimistic, so I'm sort of holding on to the fact that hopefully they
Mhm,
do.
mhm, mhm. I just find we're running out of time. I would love to read more, but time is always the limitation. So I can understand why people want a summary of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions that have come in, but okay, so this one is a little bit longer. What is your take on theory in soil ecology? Do we need to be more aware about underlying theories of what we are doing? My impression is that we move on doing experiments sometimes without having explicitly underlying theory referring to particular work paradigms. Do you yourself attempt to put studies into theoretical frameworks for your book? And so I guess this follows up on a bit of a conversation that we were having before. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's actually one of the areas I've identified as one of the sort of areas that hopefully will occupy soil ecologists in the future, because I sort of agree with that statement to some extent. That there's been a lot of information on experimental work, which is important for understanding mechanisms and how things respond. But to really make progress, I think it does need a theoretical grounding. And there's been quite a lot of that, where adoption of existing theories, above ground theories, like trait-based frameworks on plants, for example, which have been applied to soils, which has contributed to advancing the field. But I think soils are quite different to what goes on above ground. There's this vast diversity of organisms, spatially, complex environment. So, some organisms are in microsites, etc. So, those theories don't always apply. But I would certainly, I mean, that's certainly something that's important to me, would always be to try and ground the work in some kind of conceptual framework at least. And I think it's certainly an area that is open for more development in the field.
Mhm.
I did actually, I mean, Wim van der Putten and I wrote a paper in 2014, I think it was. And I think one of the conclusions that we came to was that soil ecology is relatively theory free. That's not to say there isn't theory and that there's not more, but compared to other disciplines, I think it's certainly an area that needs to be developed.
Do you think there are theories that are sort of more widely held above ground that we could be incorporating into our understanding of below ground systems? Like, are we missing sort of the obvious, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, there are some, like I mentioned before, trait-based
Yeah.
theories have contributed quite significantly, I think, both in terms of understanding how plants influence soils, but also trait-based approaches applied to soil organisms, I think, is an area that's made a lot of developments. So yeah, I think there's quite a lot of scope in these different areas. I think the other area where theories are being applied and do offer insights is in terms of stability, for example. There's a lot of general theories on diversity stability relationships and the mechanisms that underpin stability, resistance, and resilience. And again, I think that's an area where those theories can be applied and tested. They may not hold in soil systems, but I think it provides a way into studying some of these particular questions.
Mhm. Okay. How do how should we engage more classical soil scientists, so chemistry, physics, into soil ecology? That's also a great question.
Yeah, that is a good question, and I think traditionally, um, soil physics, chemistry, and biology have been relatively distinct. I mean, there have been overlaps,
Mhm.
but I think generally they've been quite distinct as disciplines. I think things are starting to change in the area. I think of soil health is a good example, really. That if you want to measure soil health, it's not just the biology or the physics or the chemistry; it's actually the integration of those
Mhm.
soil physical and chemical properties. So I'd see that as an area that really has opportunities. I think another area actually, and this is quite interesting. When I was writing the book, there are certain areas that have taken off big time, and one of them is stabilization of soil organic carbon, and particularly the formation of mineral organic matter stabilization with mineral surfaces. And again, that's a good example, I think, of how working with soil physics or mineralogy and soil
Mhm.
chemistry and also the biology is actually making pretty significant
Mhm.
advances in the field. And that's a incredibly fast moving area. I'd say it's one of the fastest and one of the hardest I've found to keep up with
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. That's a great example. I like that. I've often sort of thought about the parallels between community ecology and ecosystem ecology just as disciplines and how you feel that they should be more similar, but they actually are very different cultural approaches. One sort of looks at pattern, the other looks at process, but there needs to be a better reconciliation between those sort of ecological hierarchical levels.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
actually I started off with a degree in soil science way back in the 1980s, and we were taught physics and chemistry.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then in the last year, we had a new lecturer who taught us about biology. And that was what brought soils alive for me. But in those days, there was very little
Yeah, yeah, quite
biology.
literally brought soils alive for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
what grabbed me about the field.
yeah, yeah. Okay, second to last question. We have, do you have ideas for how soil ecology could be incorporated more into land/forest management practices?
Yeah, I mean it's a very fast moving area again. I think there's more involvement of scientists working with policymakers, for example, and also land managers at the moment. I think it really requires a different way of working. So it actually involves working with the stakeholders, etc., to design the right experiments and to make sure that they are targeted at providing the information that actually counts. So I think the door is open for much more work in those kind of areas, and I think it's already starting to
Mhm.
happen right now.
Absolutely, definitely increasing interest.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. Yeah, but I do think it requires a different way of working, and you know, sort of. I don't really like saying these things, but co-creation of sort of research ideas, etc., and approaches, and maybe different kinds of approaches
Yeah.
to the way we would traditionally test things in experimental designs.
Yeah. Do you see there being an issue of scale? A lot of processes in
Yeah.
soil happen at such small spatial scales, and the challenges of things like land management, sustainable forest management are so much bigger in terms of spatial scale.
Yeah, and I guess any form of interventions. I mean, as we were talking about before, a lot of experimental work is very local scale, and whether it's scalable to actually address a lot of these big sustainability challenges is still debatable. So that's, I think, one of the sort of bigger challenges really about how you take this information from a smaller scale and tailor it to different situations in different places. I mean, fundamentally, at the end of the day, any form of intervention that involves the ecology of soil, in my view, is going to have to be tailored in some way. I don't think there's a general practices that go out there. They do need to be tailored to particular situations, and the best people probably to do that are the people who actually work on the land.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, so this is going to be our last question.
Okay.
And I'd like to thank everybody for providing these questions. They've been absolutely excellent. So, do you have any thoughts on the importance of soil ecology in peatlands and the role they play in carbon dynamics within those soils? Research in peat soils seem to be somewhat limited in my experience, and the focus is on the environmental control, like water table manipulation, for instance, rather than the importance of restoring stable ecology.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree that peatland soil ecology work is perhaps not as prominent as in agricultural systems, forests and grasslands, etc. And yeah, a lot of the work is probably looking at impacts of climate change manipulations, for example, changing water tables, warming, for example, and how that impacts on carbon cycling and how that's triggered by the organisms involved. But I think there is a lot of potential work in there. I mean, as you say, the peatlands play a tremendous role in terms of carbon sequestration. And at the heart of that, if you're going to get more carbon in there, you obviously need plants growing and they need to be interacting with the organisms in a way that contributes to the stabilization of those carbon pools. So I think it's certainly an important area to study in the future. And
Mhm.
yeah, peatlands are extremely extensive and you know, as you say, vast reservoirs of carbon.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Richard. Thank you also, Alex, for hosting our GSBI Speaks. So let's see a copy of that book again, Richard, because this is your chance to. There
Yeah,
we go.
yeah.
Richard Bardgett's book, The Ecology of Soil, is available online. Alex has posted the links through Oxford Publishing, and I'm sure it's also available at a variety of other places where you can buy books, right?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Excellent.
And thank you very much for everyone for listening and Zoe for asking all
Yeah,
these
my
questions. I'm
pleasure.
starting to lose my voice actually.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.